For our lesson plan, we want to make sure that we are as prepared as possible to create an optimal learning environment for our learners. The lesson plan is so important because this allows you to think ahead of time exactly how you would like to teach this lesson. Let's quickly briefly discuss the lesson plan template. As mentioned in the content of Learning Unit 4, there are many different types of lesson plans that we can use, and often in the textbook's teacher's guide, we get given lesson plan templates or already worked out lesson plans that we can use. But for the purpose of this module, we are going to use the same lesson plan templates that you are required to use in your teaching practice modules. Let's quickly work through our lesson plan and how we can complete it. The first part of the lesson plan is probably the most important part of the lesson plan because this gives us information about our learners. We can include the date that we're going to be teaching the lesson. The subjects will always be EMS in our case, the grade 7, 8, or 9 in the senior phase in our case, and the topic that we want to teach will be based on the CAPS document. Let's quickly pop into our CAPS and find a topic that we would like to teach. I've just opened a copy of my CAPS document. By now, you should have yours saved on your device and be so comfortable using it. It should be your best friend and your favorite thing to read by now. Every teacher knows the importance of a CAPS document. So let's go have a look right in the middle. Let's say for grade 8, term 2, it's somewhere in May or June, and we would like to teach the topic, Factors of Entrepreneurship, Factors of Production. So the overall topic that we're going to be teaching our learners is Entrepreneurship, Factors of Production in May or June for our grade 8 learners. We can copy the topic from the CAPS document, go and paste it into our lesson plan. Oh my goodness, this is not. Okay, go and paste it into our lesson plan, factors of production, and now we know what the topic is. The duration of the lesson will be based on the amount of time that you have to teach this topic. This is another reason why lesson planning is so important. You only have so many hours in a week that you see your learners. We know from our CAPS documents and one of our previous assignments that we have a certain amount of time in a week that we see our learners for our subject. In the senior phase, there we go, that we see our learners for EMS. And that means that maybe if a lesson is 30 minutes, we will only see our learners 4 times a week in order to teach EMS. If a lesson is 1 hour, we will only see our learners twice a week to teach them EMS at most schools. Some schools have a different structure, but these are the minimum amounts of times that we need to be able to teach our lesson in a week. Let's quickly pop back down. We were by grade 8, term 2, I think, yes. So the amount of time, the duration of the lesson is really important. Let's say that this lesson is going to be a 30-minute lesson. The number of learners in the class is another important aspect to take into consideration because a lesson that I will plan for a small class of maybe 12 or 16 learners will be entirely different to a lesson that I will plan for a big class of maybe 40 learners, 50 learners, which many schools have such big classes. So you will then go and write down the amount of learners that you will have in your class. If you are not sure, we could maybe say the average number of learners in a class is anywhere between 28 and 38. Let's say for this lesson, we're going to say we've got 32 learners in the class. And then the resources available at the school is another really important planning strategy that you have to take into consideration. It will greatly impact the teaching strategy that you use in the lesson. If this is a very well-resourced school where every learner has an iPad, can quickly hop onto the Wi-Fi, Google watch a link that you send to them, that will be a very different lesson from a very limited resourced school where some of the learners don't even have textbooks. And that's where your role as a teacher comes into plan to make sure that based on the resources that the learners have, that you will be able to ensure optimum learning in your class. I would like to add one more thing to this lesson plan, and that can be the interests of the learners. This is going to be something that you're going to get to know about your learners in the beginning of the year. As you get to know your learners, this will be based on their age. Maybe right now, Pokemon is very cool. Maybe the learners love, I don't know, sweets. Maybe there's a new rapper, DJ C Kotze, our new rapper in town. Whatever the case is, we need to know what is interesting to our learners, what is relevant right now to our learners, and use that in our lesson. This again will be different for different contexts, different areas that you teach in, different countries that you teach in. So I'd like you to go and add into every lesson plan that you have what is interesting to your learners. If you don't know, go and ask them. I promise you they're going to enjoy your subject so much more if you make it relevant and interesting and fun to them. Okay, so now that we have our topic, remember we said that we're going to teach entrepreneurship, factors of production is our main topic that we're going to teach for this lesson. Now we need to go and set out our lesson objectives. What does the CAPS document and me as a teacher, what do I want my learners to be able to know and be able to do at the end of this lesson? And this we will also formulate based on our CAPS document. Let's quickly pop back into CAPS and go have a look. The content that the CAPS document wants you to teach is capital, borrowed and owned capital, labor, skilled and semi-skilled capital, the role of the workers in the business, fair employment practices, natural resources, entrepreneurship, and the remuneration of the factors of production. This is quite a lot to want to teach in only a 30-minute lesson. So let's say that for today's lesson, I only want to teach about capital and about labor. So I am going to choose, this is what you as a teacher will choose. You can base this on your teacher's guide, you can base this on your experiences, and you can also base it on the pace that you are going through the CAPS document. If you manage to get through some of the other topics really quickly, you can slow down in this topic, or maybe if, for example, the financial literacy topics, which usually takes quite long to teach, took you a bit longer, then you know how much time you have left this term in order to teach this topic. Let's say, like we said, we're going to, in today's lesson, teach about capital and labor, and maybe in tomorrow's lesson about the natural resources, entrepreneurship, and the remuneration. We're going to then go and copy this content and formulate lesson outcomes based on it. Let's copy this content into my document, and the learners will be able to explain and investigate the difference between borrowed and owned capital, the difference between unskilled and semi-skilled labor and skilled labor, and also the role of the workers in the business, as well as fair employment practices. So they will be able to explain and also investigate the difference between these different outcomes. This will then guide me in exactly what I'd like to teach the learners during the lesson. I've found that putting my outcomes in bullet form, or usually actually numbering them, makes it a little bit easier for me to be able to bring my attention back to focus on which outcome I have already covered in my lesson. Great. Once I have my objectives identified and I've gone, and you will then need to go and put it into an objective, into something that the learners will be able to know and do at the end of the lesson from the CAPS document, then I will start planning for the introductory phase of my lesson. The introductory phase of your lesson is very important because here you identify prior knowledge. This will help you then identify what new knowledge you can introduce in the lesson. So in the introductory phase, we need to find out, what do our learners know about capital? Do they even know what capital means? What do our learners know about labor? Do they know what labor means? Surely we would have introduced the 4 factors of production prior to this lesson. We would have introduced it in grade 7. And then we go and make sure, do the learners know this? Were they taught it in grade 7? If I wasn't their grade 7 teacher, I need to go and find out if they know it. They all come from different schools, different primary schools, and they may not all have the same prior knowledge. It's also really important to keep in mind that you need to remember that the learner's situation at home, their context that they live in, socioeconomic status, all of this will impact the knowledge that the learners have at the moment. So in the introductory phase, again, we plan for this in minutes. The introduction, body, and conclusion needs to all add up to a maximum of 30 minutes because remember, at the beginning of the lesson, I said that my entire lesson is going to be 30 minutes. So I'm going to plan that maybe my introduction will take 7 minutes or 10 minutes or 8 minutes or 5 minutes. You choose the amount of time that you think, that you plan will be necessary to identify and establish prior knowledge and introduce the new topic or the new content or the new knowledge that your learners are going to learn. So for the resources needed, I'm going to write down what I'm going to need in order to be able to teach this lesson. For example, I'm going to start my lesson by showing the learners a short 2-minute video on YouTube about capital and labor, for example. Or then I would need the projector and my speakers and my laptop and internet. Those would be the resources I would need. Or I'm going to write down on the board, I'm going to write down capital and ask a learner to come up and write down the definition. Or I'm just going to write down the words capital, labor, fair employment practices as random ideas on the board. And when the learners come in, I'll have a quick quiz and ask them, who knows what capital is? Johnny, please tell me what labor is. I'm going to ask them random questions like that, or the textbook, and you must also include the page number because when you're in the lesson, you can't just say textbook. What does that mean? Say our textbook that we're using, page 73, this is the page I'm going to use to introduce this lesson. Okay, there are so many different resources you can use, magazines, newspaper articles, especially about unfair labor practices. Just recently, I was reading about Shein, which most of you know is a Chinese brand that you can buy really affordable clothing on. And there's a lot of debate about if they're using unfair labor practices based on some labels that have been sewn into the clothing that says, I have dental pain or help me, and this has raised a lot of eyebrows as to, is Shein using sweatshops? Are they using underage labor? So all of this can be brought in newspaper articles. All of this can be brought into introducing our topic, but we also need to make sure that we are establishing prior knowledge. So by resources, you're actually going to plan for specifically what do you need in this introductory phase. You could use the learners' imaginations, posters, pictures, a Q&A session. Next, very specifically, what is the prior knowledge that they need in order to meet these outcomes? And the prior knowledge that these learners need is they need to know what the 4 factors of production are. They need to be able to give an example of each. This is in the grade 7 curriculum, but you need to write it down here. You need to plan for it and write it down here in order to make sure that you have a clear focus when introducing your lesson of what they should already know. And then the next question asks, how will you establish if they have this prior knowledge? How will you establish if they do know what the 4 factors of production are and if they can give an example of each? This will then be directly linked to the resources that you mentioned above. And here you can say, I will be writing down the 4 factors of production on the board, or putting pictures of the 4 factors of production on the board or on a slideshow, or whatever the case is, whatever resources you have access to. And I will be asking the learners to tell me what these 4 factors of production are, to explain how the 4 factors of production are interrelated. So you will say, I will do this through a detailed Q&A session, I will do this through a class debate, or I will do this through showing the learners a video and then asking them questions. Remember, simply showing the learners a video doesn't necessarily help you establish or know if they do have the prior knowledge. And then finally, and a very important one that you always need to plan for, is the teaching strategies that you will use in this part of the lesson. In the introductory part of the lesson, maybe you will be using a direct instruction teaching strategy in which you give the learners definitions and they need to write down new words, such as unskilled, semi-skilled, or skilled labor, such as employment practices. You may use a learner-centered approach in which you're going to ask the learners to have a bit of a class debate. So you will look at the different teaching strategies that we learned about in the previous two learning units, and you will then say which teaching strategy you want to use, and you will also say why you want to use this teaching strategy. Next, and this is super duper important, you need to write down, you need to actually plan for questions that you will ask. I like to list my questions by numbering them, and I make sure that they go from easier to more complicated or more difficult. These cold fingers. From easier to more complicated. So I'm going to list my questions. Question number 1, what is the labor? Question number 2, what is capital? And you need to actually write down the specific questions you will ask and make sure that you are providing scaffolding to the learners. By scaffolding, we mean that they need to go from easier to more challenging in order to help the learners gain their knowledge in between. The reason that you write these questions is that if during the class, for whatever reason, you forget what you wanted to ask the learners, you quickly pop back to your lesson plan and the questions are right there. Don't just use the questions that are in the textbook. Link these questions to the learners' interests and find out how you will be able to link their interests to the questions you will ask. And please, if ever I see the question, do you understand or are you okay? I am going to yell if I see it while I'm marking. These are not good questions. These are not developmental questions. I also lecture teaching practice modules, and often in your teaching practice portfolio, we see that you have asked the learners, are you okay or do you understand? This doesn't tell you anything about the learners. Standing in front of a grade 9 classroom with 38 learners asking them, are you okay? Who doesn't understand? How will you know for sure that they are going to tell you? So saying who doesn't understand and not a single learner raises their hand, perhaps because they're shy, that's not giving you any indication of if they do understand or not. So please never, ever in your lesson plan and also in the classroom, ask an overall general question, who doesn't understand? That's not a good developmental question. It's not a good teacher question. Rather, write down specific questions and ask specific learners questions. Maybe while teaching my lesson, I can see that little Lebo understands everything. She knows exactly what's going on. I can ask her a more challenging question. I can see that little Bobby really seems lost, or he's daydreaming, or he's doodling, or he's looking out the window, or he just looks really confused. And I can then ask him a few questions. You will also know at what developmental and cognitive stage each of your learners are, and you can then also ask them questions based on their ability to answer you. Don't ask a learner who struggles and who still needs a lot of gaps in his knowledge to be filled. Don't ask him a really difficult question because it will embarrass him if he can't answer it in front of the class. Instead, try to ask him a little bit easier questions and guide him to be able to answer more challenging questions as the term continues. While we're on the topic of questioning, I also would like to discourage you from asking open questions to the class and having learners raise their hands every single time. Yes, sometimes this method is good and necessary, but often if I just ask a general question to the class, what are the 4 factors of production? Usually the same learners will be raising their hand over and over, and often those are the learners who do know the answer. I want to find out about the learners who maybe don't know the answer. So if I keep asking the same question, Lebo, who really knows what's going on, will keep raising her hand over and over, and that doesn't give other learners the opportunity. So instead, I will then do cold calling. I will say to the learners, everyone quickly listen because I'm going to ask one of you a question. Let's write down the definition, or let's listen to the definition of what capital is. Or Let's quickly listen about what the 4 factors of production are. And then afterward, after I've made the learners all aware that I could be asking any one of them in the class, thereafter I go and I cold call, I name specific names of learners in the class and ask them a question. If the learner doesn't know, if I get to Bobby and I ask him what are the 4 factors of production and he doesn't know, I do not allow him to simply say, I don't know, and move on to Label, who's probably got her hand raised by now if she knows. Instead, I rather use this opportunity to try and guide Bobby in the right direction. I can say to Bobby, right, Bobby, you don't know what the 4 factors of production are, but I know that actually you do know. Let's think when we're going to go and make uh, marshmallow Rice Krispie treats for our Entrepreneurs Day, what will be necessary for us to make these Rice Krispie treats? And he's going to say marshmallows, Rice Krispies, whatever the case is. And you can say, right, Bobby, those are the natural resources that I will use. Now, how will I be able to make these Rice Krispie treats? And Bobby might say that his mom is going to put them in the microwave and help him mix them. And you're going to explain to Bobby that that is the production process and the labor. So you can then use this as an opportunity to guide and scaffold Bobby to the answer. We don't allow our learners to simply say, I don't know, and leave them alone. If it becomes extremely time consuming and Bobby really isn't getting it, we can move on to Label, ask her to give the right answer, and then go back to Bobby and say, right, Bobby, now that Label has given the right answer, please tell me, what are the 4 factors of production? That way, Bobby is learning that he can't just say, I don't know. He has to at least try. So that was a quick me getting off track on questioning techniques. But again, you need to really plan for the questions that you're going to ask. And you need to make sure these questions are going to help you identify the prior knowledge and also introduce the new topic at this point. Then the last part of your introduction, we ask you, what will the learners be doing during this activity? We don't want learners very often to just be sitting there while you are talking at them, giving them knowledge. That is a very old-fashioned classroom, and so much research has proven that that is not the best way for learners to learn. So instead, we want our learners to be actively involved. Here we could say that the learners are participating in a Q&A session. We could say that the learners need to write down their own reflections on a piece of paper, and we ask specific learners about what they've written down. We can say that the class needs to participate in a class debate where we've grouped them into 2 groups for something and against something. Whatever the situation is, our learners need to be actively doing something. Sometimes in certain situations, especially in accounting, sometimes where we're introducing a new topic, yes, the learners need to be writing down definitions, or yes, the learners need to be copying corrections off the board. But we want to try and avoid this and have our learners, as much as possible, actively doing something more than just sitting and listening or sitting and writing. Get your learners involved. This takes a lot of creativity, but don't worry, it gets so easy the more you get to know the subject content and your learners. By your 2nd and 3rd year of teaching, you really do know your learners so well, and you can use so much creativity in order to get your learners involved. Although we want it now already in your studies, we want to see it, and we also want to see it in your 1st year of teaching. When the learners are actively involved in a lesson, it gives them less of an opportunity to be naughty or challenging. I don't like the word naughty, but to be challenging and disruptive in the class. And it really makes them enjoy your subject more. Great, moving on to the body of the lesson, the main part of the lesson. And in the body of the lesson, this is where we are going to be teaching our lesson outcomes. This is where we actually have to teach these different lesson outcomes in order to make sure that our learners are gaining this knowledge. So again, the time allocation, your introduction, body, and conclusion have to add up to 30 minutes. Perhaps, yeah, I'm going to say that this part of the lesson is going to take me 20 minutes. The introduction took me 7 minutes. This part of the lesson is going to take me 20 minutes. And then I need to, again, plan for the resources that I will need. Very carefully plan. Above, we listed a whole bunch of resources. You will then plan for the resources that you will need probably the textbook, including the page number, the learner's own imagination, their own creativity, the internet perhaps, magazines, newspaper articles, whatever resources you're going to use, you're going to include here. And again, yeah, the teaching methods that you will use are very important. Now, what I can do is, in order to differentiate my lesson, I love the word differentiate. So does CAPS, so does teacher training programs. We want you to differentiate the lessons in order to meet diverse learning needs. So some learners in your class will be auditory, some learners in your class will be visual learners. You need to make sure that different parts of your lesson can then appeal to all of the different learners. Otherwise, a whole lesson where I just stand and talk at the learners, trying to just give them all the knowledge, that is only going to appeal to the auditory learners who want to listen. But instead, I can add visuals, and that can appeal to the visual learners. Your kinesthetic learners, I can get them actively involved in touching, doing, feeling, paging through newspapers, building clay models, whatever the situation is. So, this teaching method or approach that I will use in my body can be different, and I encourage you to use 2, maximum 3 teaching methods in a lesson, not too many. That can get a little bit messy and a little bit confusing for the learners and for you. But here you can use a different teaching method, and here you can have the learners go and do everything on their own. You can use a flipped classroom in which you give them the outcomes. They go outside, they plan, they gain all of the knowledge, they come back and they teach it to me or teach it to their peers. You can use different teaching strategies here. And here I want you to write down what you as the teacher will be doing. The reason that we've asked you what you will be doing is because we want to try and discourage you from being the one just giving the knowledge the whole time. I very seldomly want to see you right here, standing in the front of the class, writing on the board and talking at the learners. I don't like that. Again, in some situations, direct instruction, we learned in the previous learning unit, in some situations, direct instruction is important. It is necessary, but not all the time. And we try and differentiate it. We try and make sure that the learners are as involved in their learning as possible. Really, really important again is you need to write down, list and discuss the questions you will ask. I like to number my questions. So I like to number them question 1, question 2, question 3. Make sure that they are scaffolding questions. In other words, they go from more easy to more complicated questions. And often in my lesson plan, I write down even the name of the learner or the learners I want to ask this question to. So for example, my question will be, what is borrowed capital? And then I'm going to write down next to the learner, I'm going to write down next to the question, I'm going to write down the name of the learner that I want to ask this question to. This helps me also really in advance reflect on my learners, on their abilities. And then during the lesson, as I've maybe got my lesson plan on the clipboard and I look at these questions, I know I haven't asked Christy a question in a couple of lessons. Let me quickly ask Christy this question. I know that she's capable of answering it. If she's not, I can try and scaffold her and guide her to the correct answer. And that way, you can also plan to ask every single learner in your class a question by the end of a week or by the end of the term. This keeps the learners on their toes. They all need to listen because they never know who you're going to ask. So before asking the question, I'm not going to in the lesson say, hey, Christy, what is borrowed capital? Because what that means is that everyone in the class but Christy doesn't need to listen anymore. Only Christy needs to listen. So instead, I'm going to say, learners, I'm going to ask questions. Everybody listen carefully because a bunch of you will get an opportunity to answer. And then I will ask my first question. What is borrowed capital, Christy? And then Christy will give me a response. I could either build on Christy's response and ask the next question, or I could move on to question 2 that I have planned and ask Christy or ask a different child, Marcel, for some examples of borrowed capital. Planning your questions is super, super, super duper important. Okay, again, you will then in the body of the lesson write down what the learners will be doing. So you'll write down learners will go outside. They will, in the flipped classroom pedagogy, they will then go and plan. They will go and do research on their iPads. They will read through magazines. Maybe I've got 10 or 20 newspaper articles that I have laminated that I can use every year. The first year can be quite tough because you're still getting all of your resources together. But as you move on, second, third, fourth year, you keep these resources and use them over again. So you can ask the school to laminate a bunch of different newspaper articles for you and use them over and over again, and ask the learners to identify the factors of production from magazine articles, news articles, pictures, posters. Often just talking about how a product is made is going to be, a case study is going to be a great example. I could ask the learners to come up with their own case studies and a different group of learners to identify the factors of production from that case study. There's so much. There's so much we can do. You can hear I'm getting very excited. And then a really, really important part of the body of the lesson is how you are going to, and again, this you really plan for. How are you going to make sure that all 38 learners in front of you know what's going on? You need to write down, for example, I will do cold calling and I will ask different learners questions if it looks like they don't know what's going on. Then I will also hand out a worksheet, and learners need to answer the questions on the worksheet that I will either assess, or they will assess themselves, or their peers will assess it. Whatever the case is, at the end of this lesson, it's your job, it's what you get paid for, to find out that every single one of the learners in your classroom, yes, it can be daunting with big classes, but that's what makes it so exciting. The impact that you can have on every single learner in your classroom is wonderful. How are you going to make sure that everyone in this class knows what's going on and are meeting the lesson outcomes that we put at the beginning of the lesson plan? Finally, we get to the end of the lesson, the conclusion, and this is where I'm going to try and tie up all of the new knowledge that the learners have learned, and if I can, bring an assessment strategy into it. So, for the last part of my lesson, for this lesson, I only have 3 minutes left, so I know I must keep it short to plan for my conclusion, because remember the introduction, body, and conclusion need to add up to the total amount of time in the lesson. So my time allocation is 3 minutes. I'm going to write down what resources I need. Maybe I'm going to write down a worksheet or the questions in the textbook, or whatever the resources are that the learners need in order to participate in the conclusion. Here I can use a different teaching strategy once again to really differentiate my lesson. Now, maybe in the beginning of the lesson I used a lecture style method or direct instruction. In the middle of the lesson I used a flipped classroom. Now I can go and use a quiz or a different teaching strategy entirely. I can use so that I'm reaching more learners' learning styles in my teaching. Again, I'm going to write down specific questions I'm going to ask. I'm going to number them question 1, 2, 3, 4 from easy to more difficult. Never, ever, ever, ever ask who doesn't understand or is everyone okay? That's not a good question. And if just imagine me like yelling at the top of my lungs if I hear you asking that in your classroom, up until one day when you're a really old teacher, if you find yourself asking that, just imagine me yelling at you, because please rather plan specific questions. If you ask the whole class who doesn't understand, some learners are not going to raise their hand, some learners are not going to let you know. Instead, then ask specific questions and say to the learners, if you don't understand, please let me know what you don't understand, or come see me during break or after class, and then also ask very specific questions during your lesson. Again, what will the learners be doing during our conclusion? Maybe our conclusion is a quick Q&A session where I ask a bunch of questions. There's a really fun Q&A type where you have these quick bouncing questions off all the time. Yeah, you need to plan for it. So you ask questions really, really fast, and the learners need to all answer them, maybe throwing a ball, and whoever has the ball has to answer the question. You can make this so fun. Okay. And then finally, Africanization. This is such an important part of our new teacher training curriculum. This is such an important part that we want to bring in. Pre-colonial Africa, pre-colonial Africanization. We want to know, how did our ancestors and our forefathers, how did they learn? How did they teach? How did they live? And I would like you to try and bring this into every single lesson, the culture of the learners that you are teaching. Bring this into every single lesson, because we want to create a more culture-rich curriculum, and EMS is the perfect subject to do that with. We want to maybe sing songs, play games, traditional songs and games. Ask your learners to really get involved with this. Ask your learners to go and find out what their ancestors did, what their grandmas and grandpas and even great-grandmas and great-grandpas did when they were learning. How did they do their jobs? How did they start businesses? How did they plan their finances? Whatever the situation is, and bring Africanization into your lesson. There are a whole bunch of traditional games we can play. And in the playing of those traditional games, we can use these to teach new topics. And then finally, for the assessment activities, not every single lesson needs to include summative or formal assessment activities. Simply you asking the questions that you've planned for in every section, those are assessment activities. So here you can write down questions asked during the lesson. Or if it's a very important topic and you have a homework activity for them to do, you're going to give them the homework activity. Don't just write CAPS textbook. Write the textbook and the page number that the activity is on. Activity 3.4.1 on page 91 of our CAPS textbook. And that's going to assess if the learners know. Or you can ask the learners to assess one another, to ask one another questions. You can set worksheets. So by the assessment activities, again, this is going to link with how you will know that every learner in the class has learned what they're supposed to learn. You can also use this as an opportunity during the lesson to assess them, or after the lesson to assess them. Then we ask you just to go and reflect on how you differentiated this lesson. So by lesson differentiation, we want to make sure that every single learner in your class has an opportunity to learn in their learning style. Again, all of the learners are different. Often you will find learners with learning barriers, language barriers, reading and writing barriers in your classroom. You need to differentiate or use different teaching strategies, learning strategies, assessment strategies. You need to make sure that you use different things in your lesson for each of the learners in your classroom. If you think back to when you were in school and you had a teacher that only ever stood at the front of the classroom at the whiteboard, she had a projector on, and all you ever did was copy down from the projector. She very seldomly interacted with the learners. That's not what we want. That's not good teaching. If you are sitting at your desk, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. You are not, then you shouldn't get paid. If you're sitting at your desk all the time, you should be interacting with the learners, moving around the classroom. The learners should be interacting. If you are just the one doing all of the talking, you are not doing your job. We need our learners involved, and we want to differentiate the lesson. Yes, sometimes you do need to talk. Sometimes you do need to write on the board. Sometimes they do simply need to copy off the projector. But as much as possible, you need to be creative and find ways for different parts of your lesson to make sure that the learners, all of them, are learning. Then the very last part of the lesson plan, we ask you to write down specific words and concepts that are used in this section, in this lesson, that will be difficult or important, difficult for the learners maybe to know in advance, or difficult concepts for the learners, brand new concepts for the learners that they don't know, like unfair labor practices perhaps. And then you're just going to list these words here. The reason that we're asking you to do this after, at the end of the lesson plan, is this is going to help you reflect on if you've covered everything you need to cover in the lesson. So right now, I will write down here, borrowed capital, for example, will be one of the new terms or words or concepts that the learners need to learn. I'll write down unskilled labor, semi-skilled labor. So you're just going to write down words or phrases or concepts that the learners need to know. And then when you're done with this whole list of words or phrases or concepts, make sure that all of these are covered in your lesson.